Okay, well, we are back and we're going to be talking about different brain structures in this segment. All right, so the brainstem. Let's start there. We'll start with the bottom of the brain, the oldest part of the brain, and work our way up. So the oldest part of the brain is the brainstem, and it contains several different structures. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean by the oldest part of the brain. It's evolutionarily the oldest. All creatures that have spinal cords, all vertebrates, have brainstems. In fact, some non-vertebrates have some of these structures as well, but all vertebrates have brainstems. And so that means that it evolved a long time ago, right? When it evolved way back, a very distant ancestor that we share with all vertebrates. If you don't believe in evolution, that's fine, because it's also the oldest part of your brain. After conception, the first thing that develops is the brainstem. No body parts, nothing else. The first thing that develops is the brainstem. So it's the oldest part of your brain, that's for sure. So either way that you want to think about it, I don't care. It's fine, as long as you remember that it's the oldest part of the brain. It's deeply embedded in your brain. It's really well protected by your skull and then a nice styrofoam coating that is the outer parts of your brain. So it's really hard to hurt or harm most of these structures, right? You'd have to be really seriously injured, or it would have to be something that was an infection that worked from the inside out in order to harm these structures, which is good news because these are really super critical structures. So let's go through them. The medulla is at the very, very bottom. And, when I was an undergraduate, I was taking physiological psychology, and we had to dissect sheep brains in our lab. And the first task, we were given a brain that had, a foot or more of spinal cord still on it. And we were told, sever the spinal cord right below the medulla. And I got to tell you what, it was really hard to tell from the outside where the medulla ended and the spinal cord itself started. A lot of us cut in the wrong spot because it's really hard. It looks nice and wider in this picture, but I can tell you what, my sheep's brain, the spinal cord to medulla transition was really ambiguous. The reason I'm telling you that is that it's a very, very, very basic part of our brain. It handles the most basic of functions, heartbeat and respiration. Without these, you don't live, right? So, there's very basic stuff. So the medulla controls your rate of your heart rate. So I mentioned in the last segment about fight or flight responses. The medulla is in charge of responding to the autonomic nervous system's sympathetic nervous system cue, accelerate the heart rate. Or the parasympathetic nervous system saying, calm down, that's enough. So it's in charge of heartbeat. It's also in charge of respiration, moving your diaphragm up and down so that air will exchange. These things take care of themselves while you're asleep. You're unconscious, they will take care of themselves. So these are very, very basic things that absolutely involve no consciousness on your behalf. All right, the next level up is labeled the pons, and the biggest thing I wanted to point out about the pons, because it'll be relevant later on in the chapter, is that it seems to trigger dreaming. So there's a switch in the pons that when you enter a dream state, actually gets flipped and prevents motor messages from leaving the brain and controlling your body. So the pons is in charge of making you paralyzed while you're having a dream. Dreams are not generated in the pons. The pons is what allows dreaming to happen by paralyzing your body. I thought that was an interesting structure. So whoops, I went the wrong way. There we go. Little higher up and internal inside the pons is the reticular formation, and it's in charge of arousal. And again, I mean it by your level of alertness. You can see it's nice and close to the heartbeat and respiration areas. So if you're excited, it's very easy for the reticular formation to control the heartbeat by accelerating it through the medulla. So these structures are very unconscious reactions can happen all entirely within the brainstem. The thalamus is at the very top, And it's the part of the brain that collects all the incoming information from all of your sense organs and then sends it to the parts of the brain where it'll ultimately be processed. So when information comes in through your eyes, it goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus says, oh, that's visual, I'll send it back to the occipital lobe, and so on. So it's like the little, in the olden days, they called it the switchboard, but I'm sure you're like, what's a switchboard? So I'll say it's like the router in your house, right? It's deciding where the information needs to go. So we're having to rename some stuff because some things have gotten antiquated. All right, so these are the biggest structures along right there at the top of the spinal cord. They sort of just emerge out of that. There's one more part of the brainstem that I wanted to mention. Oh, and I forgot I put this picture in here, so hold on. I'll show you that other structure on the next slide. I forgot I was going to mention that the thalamus is the reason why we have switching of our information. Like information that comes in from your right hand is actually processed by your left hemisphere. Information coming in from your left hand will be processed in your right. That switching is attributable to the thalamus. If you think about it, as information comes in through your eyes and then goes to the thalamus, you might as well keep sending it backwards rather than have a U-turn of nerves and send it up for processing closer to the eyes. I mean, if you're going to have a thalamus, you might as well have hemispheric switching, right? Because it just kind of makes sense to keep pushing it across. So that's the best explanation I've ever heard for why the left hemisphere of the brain handles the right side of the body and vice versa. By the way, I shouldn't have said eyes because now you're probably thinking the eyes switch sides, and the eyes do not switch sides. The visual fields switch sides. So we'll talk about that in another section. But the eyes are the one exception. The ears may be a slight exception also. It looks like some of our ear information gets processed on the same side of the brain as the ear itself. But so ears and eyes are a little unusual, but everything else about your body and sense receptors and stuff get controlled like this. All right, now to that last structure, I was going to show you the cerebellum. This picture is, coming up from below so that we can see the cerebellum more clearly. First off, notice that it looks like it's got striations in it. It's like fan-folded is what it is. It's you get more surface area when you kind of crunch it up than you would have if it was just smooth. So the cerebellum has that convolutions on it that are kind of like the ones that you see above it on the cerebral cortex. I mean, the cerebral cortex is a lot more, but kind of like that. And we actually call the cerebellum, the word actually means little brain. It does a lot of the same things that the cortex would do, but just more rudimentary, right? It's just more simple. So the things they can handle. It controls voluntary movements. This is a picture of my nephew who's quite the balancer. He's been on Ninja Warrior a couple of times, and he posts these pictures of himself balancing all over the place. The cerebellum is in control of, deciding where you need to have your feet versus your arm to, hold yourself up in a position like this, right? For the rest of us, normal people like me, it's just like putting our feet flat while we're walking, the impetus for putting one foot in front of the other, all that stuff is controlled by the cerebellum. The other things that it can do is support or enable nonverbal learning. So when we get to the chapter on learning and we talk about, classical conditioning of drooling and things like that, that happens in the cerebellum. It also handles certain components of memory, not the big elaborate details that you have when you can retrieve a memory, but like it supports those fundamental abilities to store associations between things, so that that when it's dark, you're more scared. Like those very gut reaction kinds of associations that you have stored away, those kinds of memories, the basic things. All right. Now I like this picture because now we have a nice cross-section of the cerebellum, so you can see it there at the back of the brain. You can also see other structures that we've gone through so far, right? Like you see that swelling of the medulla at the bottom. You see the pons, which is that kind of ball in the front. And then you see the thalamus. It's colored yellow in this picture, and I also labeled it for you. All right. So those are the brainstem structures that I wanted to talk about. Let's move to the next level, which is the limbic system. And some people call the limbic system your reptilian brain because it handles a lot of very unconscious motivations and reactions, anger and fear, things like that. So let's talk about these structures. So this blue structure is called the hippocampus. And you actually have one hippocampus on your left side and one on your right side. Those structures are involved in holding information as it initially comes in memory. It's also in charge of awareness. Some memories are held in the hippocampus for some amount of time before being consolidated into long-term memory. Whatever you're thinking about right now, hopefully it's about the limbic system. Whatever you're thinking about right now is being done in the hippocampus. That's where we think you kind of pull information and then process it, you know, like your awareness of things happen in the hippocampus. The amygdala, which is the blue ball, and again, there's one on either side of your brain. It's, you know, tied in there with the hippocampus. It is what governs your fear responses and your anger responses, your aggression responses. There's one part of the amygdala that, when activated, makes you feel fearful, and a different part of it that makes you feel angry when you are stimulated by things that make you angry. New research has shown that when a person has had a traumatic experience, it can actually damage that area of the fear response so that it is now overreactive to similar situations. And so it may be an actual biological change that happens in the case of traumatic events. So we're really just starting to understand the amygdala. It wasn't until the 1960s that they started figuring out that that was the part of the brain that governed fear and aggression. So we're just really starting to figure it out. The green part that's under the thalamus is called the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, so it's below the thalamus. It does a lot of things. It is in charge of motivations, like your motivation for sex, or to eat when you're hungry, to stop eating when you're full, to drink when you're thirsty, stop drinking when you've had enough. Those things are all controlled by the hypothalamus. Interestingly, with the eating part of it, it takes about 20 minutes from when your food enters your stomach until the chemicals and things can get up to your brain and your hypothalamus can recognize, I don't need any more food. And unfortunately, us Americans eat so fast that 20 minutes later, we've eaten everything on our plate, and actually we would have been satisfied probably with, a third of it. So one of the best ways to try and lose weight is to just eat more slowly, like make your meal take longer than 20 minutes and let your hypothalamus tell you, I'm full. They severed that part of the hypothalamus in a rat and gave him unfettered access to food. And he ate and he ate and he ate and he ate, and he ended up being, this 12-pound rat. And he was basically just a nose and a tail and a big blob in between. Without that part of the brain shutting down consumption, we'll eat and eat and eat. I don't know how he didn't rupture his stomach. I mean, he ate and he ate. The other part of the hypothalamus handles maintenance jobs. It governs our endocrine system, which is what controls our hormones. It controls our metabolism, things like that. So it has a lot of really basic jobs. It's what is oftentimes referred to as our pleasure center, because we get pleasure from sex, or we get pleasure from eating, or we get pleasure from satisfying our thirst and stuff like that. That's a dopamine pathway that I was talking about in a previous segment. So this so-called reptilian brain handles a lot of really, moment-to-moment memories and awareness, fears and aggressions, and then, maintenance things. All right, that brings us to the top layer of our brain. So if we look at this cross-section on the right, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse moving or not. If you can, that'll probably be helpful, but if you can't, I'll just make sure that I describe well with my words. So if you look at this cross-section that's on the right-hand side, you can see some of the structures that we were just talking about in the limbic system. Actually, I did not mention something that was in this last picture. I'm going to go back real quick. So in this picture, I wanted to point out one more structure that I didn't label, and that is the smooth pink area that is above the hypothalamus and goes across like an arch. That structure is called the let's call it the cerebral cortex. No. That is called the corpus callosum. It's actually a band of fibers made up of axons and dendrites that allow the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. We're going to talk about that in another segment. Talk about what happens when that's cut, and then we can find out what the two hemispheres do. I wanted to show you that structure because now when we go to this picture, you can see the corpus callosum going across between the two hemispheres, right above what appear to be holes in the middle there. There are two holes that kind of, I don't know, look like deer antlers almost, maybe more like cow horns, something. You can see the cerebral cortex. The corpus callosum. And then you can also see the thalamus on either side. So you can kind of see things that you've seen before. The brainstem's been mostly removed from this picture, though. What we're interested in this cross-section is just the little layer that's colored orange. That's all we care about is this little orange layer around the outside. That little thin coating of neurons is what we call the cerebral cortex. It's what they call the gray matter of your brain, if you've ever heard that. All the other stuff that I've been talking about so far, and all the things that in this picture are beige, are what we call white matter, support structures. The orange part is what we're interested in here. And it's where all the higher order kinds of thinking is going to occur. All the really complex stuff is going to happen in the cerebral cortex. Now, your cerebral cortex is broken up into 4 lobes that are represented on each side of your head. So you have a frontal lobe on your left behind your forehead, and you also have a frontal lobe on your right behind your forehead. Behind your ears, you have the temporal lobe on either side. The parietal lobe is on the crown of your head, and then the occipital lobe is at the very back. And in fact, you have sort of a bump on your skull that is on the covering your occipital lobe. Each of these lobes has specific tasks that it's in charge of, as well as there's going to be some integration going on, of course, because our brain always, shares information. But we have some really specific tasks that happen in each of those lobes. Let's start super simply. I talked previously about the motor neurons and the sensory neurons. Well, the sensory neurons that collect information end up in the sensory strip, which is colored purple here. And you have a sensory strip on either hemisphere of your brain. I don't know if you guys can see that there's a nice deep groove between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. They really are separate from each other. They can only communicate with each other through the corpus callosum. So that purple sensory strip is actually in what's known as the parietal lobe. It's actually the most forward part of the parietal lobe. It's separated from the motor strip, which is the most back part of the frontal lobe. It's separated by a big, deep groove called the central sulcus. So usually you can kind of tell where the motor strip and the sensory strip should be in a person's brain, or in my case, a sheep's brain. You usually can kind of figure it out by finding that really deep groove that's between the two of them. It's pretty complex, though. I had a hard time doing it on my sheep. But so we have that motor strip that's going to control, it's going to send messages out to control the body. We have that sensory strip that collects information from the body. This little sculpture is what's called a sensory homunculus. This guy has been created so that he has big parts wherever he has lots of neurons in his sensory strip devoted to processing information from that part, and he has small parts wherever there are fewer neurons. So you'll notice right off, he's, all lips and tongue and hands, right? The genitals are inordinately large, but pretty much hands and mouth, right, including the lips and the tongue. And that's because there are so many neurons devoted to processing information from those areas. You have really sensitive mouth, lips, tongue. It's why it's so offensive when you bite yourself, isn't it? You're like, I bit myself. Well, you hardly ever bite your tongue or bite your cheek because those areas are so sensitive that they can, you can feel them really easily and know it's time to move them out of the way, which brings up the motor control. Because again, notice the mouth and the tongue are still gigantic in the motor control homunculus. You have lots of neurons devoted to controlling those structures. So not only can you feel that your lip is in the way of getting bit, but then you can move it really fast. You have really good control over it. And then, of course, he's just all hands. We have such great dexterity, and so we have giant hands. We have lots of neurons devoted to controlling the fingers and things like that. You'll notice, look how tiny his little arms and his little legs are, because there's not much you can really do with them. His eyebrows are pretty big, though, right? Because you can wiggle your eyebrows. So these homunculi are actually pretty cool little representations of how much brain is devoted to, how many neurons are devoted to these different tasks. Other senses besides touch, so the sensory homunculus, hopefully I've made it really super clear, is just in charge of touch as its sense. We also have auditory cortex in your temporal lobes, right behind your ears. You have auditory cortex that process sound. Like I mentioned before, things switch sides. So the left ear gets processed on the right auditory cortex, and the right ear gets processed on the left auditory cortex. And then we see in the back the visual cortex. And I had mentioned this in a previous segment also. Back in the occipital lobes is where the input from your eyes ultimately lands for processing. So occipital lobes do vision, temporal lobes do hearing, parietal lobes do touch. You're going to notice smell and taste are missing from my sensory functions. It turns out that those are such basic senses that they're actually initially processed down in the limbic system. And then when they do reach the cortex, it's more like activating memories. It's not working the way that these auditory cortex and visual cortex work. It's literally just activating memories in the cortex. And so that helps to explain why when you smell certain scents, it just sort of brings back a memory of things. Because smells are basically us remembering what that thing is. Oh, that's a rose. Oh, that's talcum powder. Oh, that's right, that kind of thing. So let's look at this picture again for a second and imagine, if you will, the superimposition of the sensory cortex and even the motor cortex. There's a lot that's not colored, even once you've imagined putting those two structures on top of this picture. What's left would be the association areas of the cortex. And these are areas that are not pre-wired for a specific function. Back in the fact and falsehood quiz that I gave you in chapter 1, one of the questions was, we only use 10% of our brains. Is that true or false? Of course it's false. Let's talk about someone who uses more than 10% of their brain. Well, first off, before I do that, let's mention that I think that myth came from the fact that in our cortex, just talking about cortex, probably only about 10% of the surface area is devoted to sensation or motor control. The rest of it is association area. So people may have misinterpreted the fact that we have so much available for association to mean that we don't use it. We use it. It's just that it's not hardwired for a function. Let's look at someone who does have more than 10% of his brain devoted to sensation and motor control. Oh, how about this guy? A rat. He has, if you look at the picture, you see the motor area is in red, the sensory area is in yellow, and he's got this little tiny association area. That's area where he can store memories of where he ran into a predator, or he can remember where he found food or a mate or other important events that he needs to remember. And that's it. He doesn't have a lot of creativity. He can't think of, how to design a car, or he can't come up with anything. He can basically do the things he's pre-wired to do because that's all the space he's got, right? He really doesn't have any room. Here's a little more sophisticated creature, the cat. And again, the red and the yellow, and the cat has more association area. Cats can be a little bit more creative. Cats have voluntarily let us touch them so that we will give them access to eating the rats that are attracted by our grains, Well, of course, this was thousands of years ago. Hopefully we don't still have too much of that problem, but they're like, if I just let the bipeds touch me, I can eat all these rats in their house. Right on. And then, of course, we go, oh, he's soft and he eats the rats. Right on. Symbiosis. But the cat is able to change its behavior and not just persist at being wild and things like that, in part because he has more association areas. You can train cats to do things. Some people teach them to use the toilet and things like that because they have more association areas. Now, I have to say, I'm not trying to disparage rats. I used to have pet rats when I was a child, and, I taught my rats to do all sorts of interesting things. But, they learned that I was not going to harm them, but they never really wanted the kind of affection that a cat wanted. The cat would sit on your lap, and the rat's like, I'd rather be in my cage. Or escape from you. That was always my personal favorite. Give me a chance and I will leave. Whereas a cat's like, well, I know where the food is, right? So cats have a little bit more flexibility. Not perfect. Okay, we're getting better here. Chimpanzee, look at all that association area. Now notice that this chimpanzee has a structure on his cortex that the other animals do not have at all, and that is that frontal lobe. See that area in front of the red? That's the frontal lobe. And he has that, they do not have that. He has another structure that they don't have, which is the temporal lobe. Look how under his auditory sensory cortex, there's that big bulby area underneath, and that's his temporal lobe. We know that the temporal lobe is involved in spatial tasks. The frontal lobe is involved in cultural awareness and rules and things like that. And you'll notice that chimpanzees have much more complex troops than a cat does, who's a solitary creature, or a rat, who's a solitary creature. So you see some things that chimpanzees can do that cats and rats can't, and it's largely because of those larger association areas. Now when you see our brain and you say, oh yeah, it does look like about 10% of it is highlighted for sensory or motor skills. And not only do we have the frontal lobe that the chimpanzee has, but we have in front of that a prefrontal cortex. So we have even higher order thinking than the chimpanzee, and we have things like self-awareness, or actually chimpanzees have demonstrated self-awareness. What we have is self-consciousness, where we realize, well, I don't want people seeing me naked, or things like that. So chimpanzees have a lot of, they can make vocalizations that are unique to their troop. That's kind of a little precursor to language. Well, humans can have actual language, right? Chimpanzees can learn ASL, but only if we really laboriously teach it to them. Although the ones at Central Washington University have been teaching each other some of the signs, so they can pass it on. But that's because they have those big association areas, and they can take those association areas and use them for things that are benefiting them, just like we can. We just have more. We just have more. And so we can come up with things like telephones and other kinds of things that we have been able to invent. So the association areas are not unused space. It's potential space to be used however we need it. So no, we don't use only 10% of our brain. We have hardwired only 10%. And by the way, when people say that brain thing, they've got to be only talking about the cortex, because the limbic system and the brainstem, it's all doing its job all the time. It can't be part of the discussion. We're only talking about the cortex. The cortex is not hardwired in most of the areas. And it's going to be really important when we come and talk a little bit about brain plasticity. So I'm going to stop here, and then I'll come back in the next segment and talk about brain plasticity, how important those association areas are.